Brandon, thank you so much for that. Thanks to all of you for being here this evening. I know that there's nothing else going on in the world because you're here tonight to talk with me. And I find that remarkable because as I go around, I say this all the time, my campaign hates it, every single time I say it. I am campaigning to be the most boring Supreme Court justice in the history of the state. And there's a reason for that. It's because that's what the job calls for. We don't do new and exciting and original and innovative things on the court. We do one thing and one thing only. We decide questions of law. And that's it. We take the existing law and we decide the cases that come before us. And then the next day, when we come into chambers, we take the existing law and we decide the cases that come before us. And the next day we come in, well, it's the same. And on and on and on ad infinitum. That's the value of having a court instead of a second legislature. Now, that's what I'd like to talk about a little bit this evening, and then perhaps when I'm done, we can take a few moments for questions, because I'm really actually much more interested in what you're thinking. So I think that as we come up on April 4th, we have a stark decision to make in front of us. Will we continue with the rule of law, or will we trade that in for the rule of Janet? Here's what I mean by that. The rule of law is a pretty simple idea. It's the promise that we get to know in advance what the law requires of us. And that way, for those of us who wish to lead their lives in conformance with the law, you can see what it requires, and then you can conform your actions to that. Pretty simple. Well, not everyone is convinced that's the way the government should work. So the rule of Janet is this. She's made it abundantly clear that if elected, she would place herself above the law. Now, she's been remarkably clear about this in a way that is kind of shocking to me. And I realized, actually last summer, that this was going to be an election like no other. Mostly because my opponent is a candidate like no other. So over the summer, I was reading an article in the New York Times, and I read that so you don't have to, by the way, so you're welcome. And they were saying there where if the left captures this seat, they intend to completely transform the state of Wisconsin. And then they laid out how they'd do it. They said they would take all the legislative initiatives they haven't been able to get passed through the legislature, and they would just cram them down on you through the courts. And I looked at that and I thought, well, that's a pretty brazen statement of an intent to abuse the Constitution and the people of Wisconsin. But I thought, surely no judicial candidate would buy into that plan. But then along came Janet, and she does buy into that plan. In fact, I was watching a show a couple months ago, Capital City Sunday, maybe you've seen it, and she was being interviewed about her judicial philosophy. And you know how we talk about the work of the courts sometimes in metaphorical terms? We talk about the scales of justice, and how the jurist's job is to hold those scales straight, true, and even, and allow nothing but the law and the facts to influence which way it tips. Well, she was asked about that, and she said, well, if she's on the courts, then in the vast majority of cases, there won't be a thumb on the scales. I looked at that, and I'm like, is that meant to reassure us? Because you're not supposed to have your thumb on the scale in any case. And if you do it even just once, that disqualifies you from any office of trust in the judiciary. All right, well, that's the problem. But what does that tell us about Janet? Well, number one, I'm not sure if she knows this or not, but putting your thumb on the scale is the oldest picture of dishonesty that we have available to us. That's the very definition of cheating. All right, so what are the practical consequences? So that's a problem, but what does it mean? Well, when I need to get perspective on a question, I have a tendency to go back to history, see what it can teach us. So I go back 235 years to when the United States Constitution was young, and the framers were writing about how the new government would function. And one of those, Alexander Hamilton, was writing about the courts. Now, you know Hamilton, right? He's the Broadway star, yeah, that guy? Turns out he wrote about the courts too. So he said this, the courts would be the least dangerous branch of government. And he said that liberty would have nothing to fear from the courts. Sometimes, perhaps we want to look backwards and say, oh, Alexander, if you've only known, if you'd only seen what we've seen, maybe you wouldn't say that. Well, he didn't see it, but he did foresee it. He went on to say, I mean that courts won't be a danger to liberty if they just do the work of the courts, just using the existing law to decide the cases to come before it. He concluded with this. He said, however, if the court should ever combine its power with that of another branch of government, then liberty would have everything to fear. All right, so let's pick up Hamilton's lesson, see what that says about what Janet's been telling us. So she says if she's on the court, in the vast majority of cases, there won't be a thumb on the scales, which means, of course, that in some cases there will. And what does it mean when you put your thumb on the scale in deciding a case? Well, what it means is you are creating a brand new standard of decision and using that to decide the case instead of the law. So when you do that, you are in essence creating a new law. And which branch of government has the authority to make the laws? The legislature. That's right. So she's telling us in advance, before the election, her plan for the state of Wisconsin is to combine the power of the courts with the power of the legislature. Now, if Hamilton were here, I think he would look at Janet and say, oh, Janet, liberty has everything to fear from you. And I think that'd be right. So what does that look like in operation? Well, Hamilton gave us another metric by which we can analyze this. He said, courts have neither the power of the purse nor of the sword, but merely judgment, just judgment. It could truly be said that a jurist is made out of nothing but words. And the power of those words is entirely dependent on the integrity of the person speaking or writing them and the probity of their analysis. So let's take a look at my opponent's judgments. So for a circuit court judge, you'll see that most clearly in the criminal sentences that they impose, because that's the area where they have the most discretion, and that gives us a good look into their juridical mind. And so I look at some of the work that she's done in criminal cases, and it's problematic. So I'll go through just a couple of cases as examples. We can't spend the time to go through all of them. We'd be here the rest of the evening, and I'm told that we only have until like 10 o'clock tonight, so, right? So we'll take a look at a few of them. One, a handful of years ago, a man walks into a room where a woman is sleeping and proceeds to violate her in the most personal, intimate way possible, and brutally so. He was duly convicted, came before my opponent for sentencing, and her sentence, well, it was 1 year and 2 months in prison. That was all. Now, during the sentencing, she heard testimony from the victim. And the victim talked about how she could no longer go to work, couldn't bear to be around others, how she sobbed every day, how her closest friend abandoned her as damaged goods. And yet, 1 year and 2 months. Now, she's going to have to live with that pain the rest of her life. And my opponent says that's worth 1 year and 2 months in prison. So that's bad enough. But what's really chilling is the reasoning she used to come to that conclusion, that judgment. She said, well, when I look at you, I see a good man in you. Good man? Accused of that crime? I don't know how you say that. She wasn't done. She went on to say, and you know what, I don't think that you're going to be a danger to society because after all, this was just a crime of opportunity. As if the man walking into a room to find a sleeping woman is an opportunity rather than a heinous crime. I didn't mention the woman was his cousin. So not even being family was enough to protect her from this guy. And yet Janet says, no danger to society. Well, I don't know how that works. I don't see that that is a judgment that is sound or reasonable. But that's just one case. So how about another? Same type of crime against a 13-year-old girl. The guy videotapes it and then posts it to Facebook. Now, you know what happens when you put something on the internet, right? It lives there forever. That video is going to be there until the end of time. That young girl, 13 years old, is going to have to live with that the rest of her life and then relive it every single time it comes up on the internet. Duly convicted, comes before my opponent for sentencing, and she says, no prison time at all, not a single day. Again, different man, same crime, 15-year-old girl, duly convicted, comes before my opponent for sentencing. She says, again, no prison time. But again, it's the reasoning that's chilling. She looked at him and said, well, you know, but for COVID, I would be giving you a substantial amount of time in the House of Corrections. But these are odd times, and so I'm not going to. Think about that for a moment. And I've been thinking about this case for weeks now. I still can't figure out what COVID has to do with whether this guy belongs in prison. I think that's a broken judgment. Now, those are just 3 cases. We could go through a whole lot more. She tells me that I'm cherry picking, but I don't know at what point in the length of this list of cases it stops being cherry picking and becomes a pattern. But we've long since passed cherry picking. We're far into patterns. So that judgment is problematic. And it's not just in the work that she does on the court. It goes beyond that, too. So you may have seen some ads about me, perhaps. Yes? Yeah. These are horrible ads. Each one of them is a lie. And I don't mean taken out of context or spun. They're lies in the sense they are made up. She just sits down one day and says, what can I say about Justice Kelly that will be harmful, without regard to whether it's true or not? And then that's what they do. Now, we could spend the entire evening talking about how each one of those is a lie, but I don't think you've got the time for it, and probably not the interest. But if you are interested in knowing the truth of it, you can go to my website, justicedanielkelly.com, and at the top we have a fact check tab, and you click on that. We are compiling all of my opponent's lies about me and then telling the truth. And the truth is this: she's a serial liar. Now, it is shocking that I would have to say that in a race for a judicial office where honesty and integrity is the lodestone of the work of the courts. And yet there she is, saying, doing anything she thinks is necessary to get to this position. And I think that's a problem. I think that tells us an awful lot about her judgment. Now, I've been told that I should grow a thicker skin. That if you're going to run for office, this is just the price that you pay. And you need to let it roll off your back. And maybe I should. And sometimes I pretend that I have a thicker skin than I actually do. But I don't. This bothers me a lot. And here's why. When I was young, growing up, our family didn't have a whole heck of a lot. My mom and my dad had to stretch the dollars pretty thin to get from one month to the next. And one day I was a teenager. My dad sat me down and said, now, Dan, when I'm done with this life, I'm not going to have a whole lot to leave you. But I'll make you this promise. I will leave you a good name. Now, a year after I graduated law school, his comments came to pass. And he didn't have much to leave me. A couple of cufflinks, a broken pocket watch. But he left me a good name. I've treasured that my whole life. And it has been my ambition to pass down that good name to my children. But now, I've got a serial liar out there trying to trash my father's legacy. And I think that is outrageous. I think it's irresponsible. I think it reflects horribly on my opponent as a person. And yeah, that's what she does. Now, maybe it's true that this is the price you have to pay. But how is it that we came to this point in time where you have to sacrifice your good name to run for office? I think that's a travesty. And I think this is one of the reasons that it keeps a whole lot of good people from running for office. I would hate to see this kind of ugly gambit prevail in the state of Wisconsin. Because if it does, if this works, if you can just make things up about someone else, lie about them from start to finish, and that works, that gets you elected, you know what's going to happen? Well, you're going to get a whole lot more of that. Who's studying business in here? Anyone? All right. You get more of what you pay for, right? That principle holds true here as well. If you buy into what she's doing, if the rest of our fellow Wisconsinites buy into what she's doing, you'll get more of that. Other candidates will look at that and say, oh, well, that's how you win a race. You just lie your way through it. Destroy someone's good name, just for the sake of power. All right, so what do we do about this? I hear tell that we have something coming up next Tuesday. You know anything about that? Something, election or something? We're closing in pretty quickly, and I've got something I'd like to ask you. Now let me start with this. I hope you know that all of the authority and all the power to create and maintain governments here in Wisconsin belongs to who? Who does it belong to? We the people, right? All the power to decide who sits in the seats created by your Constitution belongs to we the people. That's a lot of power. Now, I learned from Spider-Man movies that with great power comes great responsibility. So there's all your power to create and maintain your governments, and all that power to decide who sits in those seats. Well, here comes the responsibility. It's up to you to decide who will best serve you in your Supreme Court. And then your responsibility is to do something about it. Vote, yes, absolutely. But there's more. There's more. You know, there's the turnout in the fall election this past year was 2.6 million. If we get to 1.6, 1.8 million on Tuesday, that'll be a lot. So that's an 800,000 to a 1 million vote drop-off from fall to spring. 800,000 to a million people that decide not to vote. Now that power and that authority belongs to all of them too. So maybe you could reach out to those you know who don't normally vote in spring elections and say, hey, I got a couple things I'd like to share with you. I think they're important. And then talk to them about the difference between the rule of law and the rule of Janet. The difference between the Constitution protecting your liberties and instead Janet deciding which liberties you get to enjoy and which you don't. And then help them understand how to exercise that power and that responsibility that they have. It's immense. And if you do that, I think we're going to be just fine. But here's my worry. To secure the rights that we enjoy today took an enormous sacrifice. I don't know if you've looked into the lives of those who signed the Declaration of Independence way back in 1776. But they said at the end of that document that they pledged their troth, their good names, their fortune, their honor, and their lives. For most of them, didn't work out well. They died in the war, were bankrupted, convicted of treason by the British government. But they knew they were walking into that possibility. And they decided it was so important to secure these liberties, they'd rather go through that than live without them. Now today, there are those who continue to put their lives on the line so that we can continue to enjoy these liberties. But there's more than one way to lose them. The other way is to just walk away. My concern is I don't know what's going to happen on Tuesday. It is entirely possible that we as Wisconsinites will sleepwalk right through Tuesday. We'll just walk away from our Constitution and all the liberties that it protects. And we'll just decide it's just not that important. It's not worth the time and the effort to do something about it. And we weigh what does it take to go and vote versus what else I would rather be doing. And then choose, I'd rather be doing something else. Compare what it took to secure these rights to what it takes to maintain them. It's not hard. The price is negligible. Get up in the morning, make some time, make your way down to the polling station, fill out a ballot. That's it. You're not going to risk your life, not risking bankruptcy, not risking treason charges, none of that. You just vote. And if we value our constitutional heritage, which here in Wisconsin is going on 175 years now, if we value that, it's a small effort to make. But I don't know what's going to happen on Tuesday. But I do know that I don't want to be the generation that says we don't care about our Constitution that much anymore, that we don't care about the liberties that it protects anymore, and that we're willing to just walk away from it, let someone else have them. I hope that's not this generation. I'm working as hard as I can to make sure it is not this generation that breaks that 175-year commitment to our Constitution and the liberties that it protects. So that's what I have for you, except for this one request, and it is this. You might know that doing a statewide campaign is a difficult thing to do, especially for an introvert like me. This is not my comfort zone, as it turns out. So I don't know if any of you pray, but if you do, I'd sure appreciate it if you remember me when you pray, and my wife and our children as well. I'd so much appreciate that. You might be able to tell from my last name that I come from a pugilistic people. What are the Irish known for? Anyone? Fighting. Fighting, yes, and? Drinking, of course. And they do them best when they do them together. So here's the thing. I get to go around the state of Wisconsin, and I get to mix it up with the activist arguments every single day in this campaign, and I love doing that. That's an outlet for me. But my wife is Italian, and she has no outlet at all. And so please, if you pray, would you remember my wife when you pray? And I'd be so very grateful. Well, listen, thank you so much. May God bless you and our great state of Wisconsin. And if you have any questions, let's have them out, see what you're thinking.
Everyone, thank you. Justice Dan Kelly.
Thanks,
you.
Allie.
Yeah, thank you.
Do we have time for questions, or?
Sure. If anyone wants to ask a few questions, just our College Republicans members, just make sure that you guys get priority. Does anyone have a question for Justice Kelly?
Surely you must, because I could not possibly have told you all about the courts and everything in that short of time. Yes.
Hi. So I know there have been a few instances where Janet has refused to show up to a forum or a debate.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that kind of situation a little bit, or why you think that is, or like what has been your perception of her inability to, express?
Yeah. Well, thank you for that question. And that has been troubling to me. We've been invited to over a dozen debates. I've accepted every single one of them. And Janet has agreed to just one. It was the one that we had last week, Tuesday, at the Wisconsin Bar Association. The reason this troubles me is because my sense of it is she's hiding behind her slickly produced ads. And I think that's wildly inappropriate for a candidate for public office. You need to present yourself to your potential bosses, right? So let me talk about that just a little bit. So because you all have all the power to create and maintain governments, the relationship between you and those who serve you in government is the relationship between boss and servant, right? And I know that you're the bosses and we're the servants in government. And so when you are campaigning, it's essentially an interview process for a job. You go to your bosses and you allow them to question you about what you're about and what you understand about what the job requires. And Janet's just refusing to do that. Instead, she's sending out some slick glossies and saying, I want the job, but I don't want to talk to you. Here's some literature. Be content with that. And I don't think that does it. Because it doesn't give the bosses an opportunity to ask the hard questions, to find out what you're really about. Now, I think my personal opinion about why she won't do this is largely illustrated by the debate that we did do a week ago Tuesday. So I don't know if any of you saw that debate. Anyone see it? Okay. So we saw what she was about. She revealed herself to be a politician who dresses up like a judge. All she talks about is her politics, start to finish. And it's not just in that debate, it's around the state of Wisconsin. All she talks about is her politics. All right, well, where do political differences get resolved? Which branch of government? It's the legislature, right? So why is she talking about the legislative work when she's running for a position on the courts? The kinds of things that we should be talking about in this campaign are the nature of our Constitution, the importance of the rule of law, where the authority comes from that we use, and what is the nature of the loan to us as in the judiciary, or what our judicial philosophy is, or what it takes to be a good jurist. Those are the things that are relevant to the work of a court. So that's what we should be talking about. And what we found out last Tuesday is that she either doesn't know anything about that or she's just not interested. Because again, all she does is talk about her politics. So I think we need a lot more of those debates so that everyone around the state can see what she's about. And then decide, and look, you are the bosses. If you decide you want a politician who dresses up like a judge, well, there's a candidate who's running like that, and that's Janet. And if that's the kind of person you want on your court, she's there to pick. So how about we show that to everyone in the state of Wisconsin so that they can know the difference between a jurist and a politician who dresses up like a judge. And she's just not willing to do that. So I'm afraid that she's just made the decision she's going to hide behind those slick ads and the lies that she tells about me and hopes that it's enough. What else?
I'm sorry, we have time for like 2 more questions.
2 more. See, I should talk shorter. That's...
Anyone?
Yes, ma'am.
Following the tragic school shooting on Monday in Nashville, do you think that there will be any change with gun laws, like following that event, and what do you think about everything that happened on Monday?
Yeah, well, it was a travesty. And could there be a change in the law? Sure. Now, the question is, how does that change come about? And so, understanding that we have separated out the law-making function from the law adjudicating function, that change in the law would need to go through the legislature. And then, if it's challenged on constitutional grounds or other grounds, that could potentially come to the court. But then our job in addressing that question is not to decide whether we like that statute or not, whether we think it's effective or not. It's to measure it against the Constitution. And if it's consistent with the Constitution, then we use that statute to decide the case. If it's inconsistent with the Constitution, then we have to privilege the Constitution over the statute. So, and that kind of goes back to the nature of the work that the court does. We're not the innovators. We're not the policymakers. The people of Wisconsin look to their legislature to do that. And then we take the work product that they do, and then we use that to resolve the cases. So could this potentially result in a change in the gun laws? Sure. What else? Yes, sir.
I'm new to Wisconsin, but what are the...
Welcome.
Thank you. What are the major cases that are expected to
Yeah. Now, if not for my opponent, I would say I don't know. I know what my opponent believes. If she wins, what are the major cases that would come to the court? There'd be things like redistricting, Act 10, school choice, all the policy decisions that are in conflict with her personal politics. So what she's looking to do, and this is why I describe her as a politician who dresses up like a judge, her objective is to take the judicial power and do what she could not do in the legislature. It is to go back and repeal all of those laws that conflict with her personal politics. So if she wins, then I would expect that those are the kind of cases that would come up. If I win, I have no idea, because it'll just be the normal work of the court. People who get their decision from the Court of Appeals, and they say, I don't think this comports with the law, and so we want the Supreme Court to review it. And so it would go, I think, very much along the lines that the court has been going over the last several years. All right?
Everyone give it up for Justice Dan Kelly.
Thank you, everyone.